1.
At the National Press Club today, a debate on climate change. Lord Monckton is a noted sceptic who travels the world challenging the notion humans are solely responsible. He faces Dr. Richard Dennis, economist, executive director of the Australia Institute and former advisor to the Greens. Today at the National Press Club.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the Press Club and today's National Australia Bank address. In fact, it is a debate on climate change, one of the issues that is causing so much controversy with the Australian people as the political debate plays out. But today we are very pleased to bring a debate between Richard Dennis, Dr Dennis, a former advisor to Democrats leader, one-time Democrats leader Natasha Stott-Despoja. Dr Dennis is Executive Director of the Australia Institute and an adjunct professor with the Australian National University. He will be debating Lord Monckton, a gentleman on his third visit to Australia, it's fair to say, on a tour that has courted some controversy. In fact, probably not since Joe Cocker was deported in '73, have we seen a British tour cause such controversy. Monckton is a well-known climate sceptic, and he will be taking up the cudgels for that aspect of the debate. We have had a toss, and Richard Dennis will open the bowling. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr Dennis.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks to the Press Club and to Lord Monckton and, of course, to the audience for paying attention to what is a very, very important issue. Some would say the most important issue of our time. Now, I have to begin with a confession. It's true I worked for the Democrats and worked for the Greens, but I have not and am not and will not ever be a member of the scientific community. I am an economist, and I'm here today to talk about the way that economists and certainly politicians, as a general rule, go about making decisions under uncertainty. This is not an unusual situation for individuals to find themselves in, certainly not an unusual situation for politicians to find themselves in. Making questions when some people have doubts is, in fact, core business for citizens and for policymakers. So let me start with an analogy. Imagine that you went to the doctor, and I hope this doesn't happen, but imagine that you were diagnosed with a skin cancer, and the doctor, having diagnosed this skin cancer, suggested an intense and rapid treatment. The treatment unpleasant and potentially expensive, but the prognosis was good. Now that's bad news, and you might wish that it were other, so you might get a second opinion. You go to see another doctor, they confirm the diagnosis. You see a third doctor, you see a fourth doctor, they all confirm the diagnosis. But after after shopping around for long enough, spending more time while the cancer potentially spreads, you finally find a doctor who advises you that you don't have cancer. And even if you did have cancer, chemotherapy and radiotherapy are unlikely to work. There's plenty of evidence on the internet to suggest that herbal remedies would be far more effective. What would you do? What would you do? If there are people out there telling you don't act. There are people out there saying the solutions won't work. But how would you, as a person, make a decision under such uncertainty? Now, I reckon most people would go with the science, and I think it's called me old-fashioned, but I think it's just common sense. And I certainly suspect that our children and our family would encourage us to take the cautious route and listen to the science, not the optimistic route that perhaps the science is wrong and anyway maybe the treatments don't work. Now, anyone can ask a tricky question, but not all of us can make hard decisions. And we do have to make hard decisions when we make decisions about health, we make decisions about climate change. Making hard decisions is something that adults have to do. But tricky questions can often get in the way of hard decisions. Imagine one of your friends discourages you from seeking treatment, says you can't trust these doctors, what do they know? They say the sun causes skin cancer. You go back and you ask them, you say, if I get sunburnt tomorrow, when will I get a skin cancer and on what part of my body will it appear? And if they can't answer, then why would you trust them? Why would you pursue a potentially unpleasant and even costly course of action? Again, common sense suggests that most of us, while we might have those questions in our mind, will probably be willing and able to make a hard decision. Now, the overwhelming scientific consensus of climate change, of climate scientists on climate change, is that climate change is occurring, that the planet is warming, that it's human-induced, and that if we are to reduce our levels of pollution, that we have a good chance of turning things around. And when I say scientists, I mean NASA, I mean CSIRO, I mean the Australian and American Academies of Science. These bodies are quite clear in their statements. They are quite clear in their diagnosis, and they are quite clear in the prescription that they suggest that we take. But let's be clear, today you're watching a debate between two non-climate scientists. I'm not a climate scientist, Lord Monckton isn't a climate scientist, but we both obviously have an interest in the decisions that we as a society will make. The question is, how will we use the data that's provided to us by those esteemed bodies, or will we ignore that? That's a question for us as individuals, it's a question for us as a society, but we need to be clear about whose expertise that we are going to take. When we talk about experts, I'm not a climate scientist, most of you aren't climate scientists, we all have to make these decisions. It's not just the climate scientists that have made these decisions. In fact, in Australia, that well-known warmist John Howard accepted the science of climate change. He accepted that we needed to tackle climate change, and yes, he was reluctant to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, but in 2007, of course, he proposed the introduction of a price on pollution to tackle climate change. It's not just John Howard, of course. We've seen, in fact, nearly every leader of the Liberal Party has accepted the science of climate change, back to Andrew Peacock, Brendan Nelson, Malcolm Turnbull, and Tony Abbott, at least half of the time, seems to support the science of climate change. His support for climate science is about as reliable as his support for Peter Reith, but it is there at least some of the time. And it's not just Conservative politicians who are the warmists. We find in Australia that the big mining companies, the big oil companies, all accept the science of climate change. Their submissions to the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme inquiries overwhelmingly supported the science of climate change. And in Australia we have Ralph Hillman, the head of the Coal Association, along with a number of other leaders of the minerals community, all supporting both the science of climate change, and Marius Kloppers, the head of BHP, the biggest mining company in the world, not only supports the science of climate, but Marius Kloppers actually supports the introduction of a carbon tax to tackle the problem. Warmist. My point is that not only is the vast majority of climate scientists looked at the evidence and drawn these conclusions, our business leaders, our politicians from all sides of the political fence have actually taken that same advice and around the world are acting on it today. Not acting nearly fast enough, but acting nonetheless. Of course, it could be part of a giant conspiracy with BHP, Greenpeace, John Howard and my good self meeting regularly to discuss our proposals. Or it could just be that good people of goodwill, people who respect the evidence from a vast variety of backgrounds, have all accepted the same overwhelming conclusion and have all accepted that we should act. Now, even though the scientific community leaves very little room for doubt and very little room for uncertainty, even if there was uncertainty, most humans, most of the time, actually adopt the insurance principle when considering how to make decisions. That is, most of us insure our cars. Most of us spend $1,000 or more a year insuring our cars, and very few of us get to the end of the year and think, idiot, didn't crash my car. What am I doing? Wasting my money on a precaution that didn't even turn out to be necessary. As individuals, as a society, this is not how we make decisions about uncertainty. It's not responsible, indeed it's not even mature. And we usually find the people with uninsurance, the people without insurance are usually people we describe as perhaps being adolescent or even immature. The sensible thing to do when the overwhelming body of evidence suggests that we should act and the costs of that action are small is to act. Now let me turn to the cost of action, because it's interesting that so many of the climate sceptics are also policy sceptics. That is, there's no reason to assume this would have to be the case, but so many people who don't trust the science don't trust the economics. And of course I'm referring here again to Tony Abbott, because Tony Abbott can't find a single economist in the country who will suggest that his scheme is in fact cheaper. So for the sceptics who tell us they're terrified of wasting billions of dollars tackling climate change, I would ask the simple question, why aren't you far more concerned with the cost of Tony Abbott's direct action scheme when every economist in the country, Tony Abbott can't find a single economist in the country to stand up and say his scheme is cheaper? Why is it that the climate sceptics are also economic sceptics? Are they all in on the conspiracy? Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I'll now invite Lord Monckton to make his opening remarks. Lord Monckton, please.
My lords, that's me. Ladies and gentlemen, the climate, like the cricket, is chaotic. Who would have believed that England would not only win back the Ashes, but would then hang on to them the next time round? Just thought I'd rub it in. Now, because the climate is chaotic, or even if it isn't, it acts as though it were, it is not predictable in the long term. And that, if you do science by consensus, and that was the central argument that Professor Dennis offered us today, that there is a consensus. If you do climate by consensus, then the consensus is expressed in the documents of IPCAC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And they say that the climate is a coupled, non-linear, chaotic object, and that therefore the long-term prediction of future climate states is not possible. The Royal Society, in a complete rewrite of its original disastrously unscientific statement about the climate, now says we do not know how much the planet will warm as a result of our activities. And the idea that you decide any scientific question by mere consensus is opposed by the philosophers of science from Aristotle 2,400 years ago to Al-Haytham, the founder of the scientific method in 11th century Iraq, to Karl Popper in 1934 in the celebrated paper that formalized the scientific method as an iterative algorithm. In none of these people's opinion is science, or was it, or will it ever be, decided by consensus. As Einstein himself said when replying to a book by the Nazis who regarded his science as Jewish science, and they wished to attack it, and they had 100 scientists against Einstein. He said, if there is something wrong with my theory, one paper will be enough to set the entire theory aside. You won't need 100 scientists. So merely counting heads, the argumentum ad populum, merely saying that various scientific societies are august, the argumentum ad verecundiam, the arguments from head count fallacy and reputation fallacy, respectively, are not proper scientific arguments. The sort of questions that you might have asked, and perhaps should ask in a free country, are these. You might have asked, I wonder why the usual suspects cry consensus when it is so clear in the history of science that consensus is not the way science is done. Why does official climate science still pretend the Middle Ages were not warmer than the present, when the fabricators of the 2001 UN report's purported abolition of the medieval warm period are now under criminal investigation for defrauding taxpayers by tampering with data and results? I wonder why the published version of the 1995 UN report, written by just one man, stated the exact opposite of the scientists' final draft, which had said 5 times that no human influence on global temperature was either discernible or immediately foreseeable. Or I wonder why the published version of the 2007 UN report deploys a flagrantly fraudulent statistical technique to pretend that the world is warming ever faster and that we are to blame. And why do we think that we're going to suddenly get 3.3 Celsius for a doubling of CO2 concentration this century, that's the IPCC's central estimate, or 5.1, which is your government's central estimate, when all the science done by measurement and observation rather than by models suggests just 1 Celsius degree? And then Professor Dennis raised the question of the insurance principle. Just in case there might be a risk of a large asteroid hitting us, we should spend 150% of global GDP from now forever to try to make sure we have a large cricket bat to knock them out of the way again. And in the London insurance market, we have a saying, and that is that if the cost of the premium exceeds the cost of the risk, don't insure. And that brings me to the carbon tax and the mineral resources rent tax. Now, both of these taxes are going to cost more than the cost of letting global warming happen in the first place. One question we should ask is, how much global warming will a 5% reduction in Australia's emissions, which represent in turn 1.2% of global emissions, actually achieve? Well, here's the numbers. 0.06% of world carbon emissions remitted over the next 10 years, and the amount of carbon dioxide that would have been in the atmosphere, according to the IPCC, would fall from, wait for it, 412 to 411.987 parts per million. And this would forestall, wait for it again, 0.00007 Celsius degrees of global warming. This is consensus mainstream calculation. And this is 1/14,000th of a Celsius degree. It is 1/700th of the threshold below which no modern method or instrument can detect any change in global temperature at all. And how much will it cost? Around 127 billion over the next 10 years. And if you were to apply the Gillard method all over the world, a method as cost ineffective as her proposals, then it would take $60,000 per head of the world population just in the next 10 years, or 60% of global GDP, just to forestall the 0.23 Celsius of global warming that the IPCC predicts will occur over the next 10 years. And it is clearly cheaper to do nothing about global warming and to adapt in a focused way to any consequences that are adverse that may occur from any warming that may occur, than to spend any money whatsoever now on it. And that, if you do science by consensus, as Professor Dennis does, is the overwhelming consensus in the peer-reviewed economic literature. And it's the peer-reviewed literature that you find the true science in. And reviews of that literature by Lomborg in 2007 and Richard Toll in 2009 make it abundantly clear that the majority, in fact, a near unanimity among economists, show that it is greatly more expensive to try to intervene and to try, Canute-like, to tamper with the climate than simply to sit back, enjoy the sunshine and adapt in a focused way as and if and only when necessary. And therefore, the carbon tax is the wrong solution to a non-problem. It has no place in the future of Australia. And what I should have liked to hear from the press of Australia is those pressmen speaking up for the heroes of labour, the mine workers who are menaced with the destruction of their jobs, the men who dig the darkness underground to bring us light. These great men, a dozen of whom joined me in the Hunter Valley on the platform when I spoke there last week and received a standing ovation from their terrified community. They want you, gentlemen of the press and ladies of the press, to speak for them. The coal workers, menaced by Prime Minister Brown with a destruction of their industry. And we too once had a Prime Minister called Brown, and we learned not to do that. So please, speak up for your working people. The tie that I wear today, and I proudly wear today, is the tie of the Democratic Labour Party, Senator John Madigan's party. I had the privilege of spending yesterday with this great man. And here is a man who speaks for Labour, who speaks for the people who are going to be disadvantaged by this tax. These are the people who need your help, not merely uncritically to accept consensus, but instead to ask the questions about the fraudulent science which is in each of the conclusions of the three major IPCC reports. Ask questions about why it is that global warming is happening at the moment and has been happening over the last 60 years at only 1/5 of the rate now predicted by your government. Ask the question how, in science, there could be any chance that the rate of just roughly 1 Celsius per century of warming that has been occurring can suddenly become roughly 5 Celsius per century, as it were, overnight. There is no physical basis in science for any such sudden lurch in what has proven to be an immensely stable climate. And the people of Australia are frightened. They are frightened of their government. They are frightened of you. The world is also frightened. Australia is now regarded as a sovereign risk. Please, I beg you, do not merely accept consensus. Think and think again. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we now turn to questions from our journalists in the audience. The first question today is from Christian Kerr.
Christian Kerr from The Australian. A question to both our participants. Gentlemen, neither of you, as you have said, are scientists. Both of you have worked for very different politicians of very different philosophies. Today, aren't you just engaging in that old battle between laissez-faire and the central planners and the centrally controlled economy?
Lord Monckton.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that fascinating question, Christian. And indeed, you could say that I am by inclination a non-interventionist. However, let it be very clear, if anyone convinces me that the science points to an alarming and dangerous rate of global warming, then I will change my tune and I will say that perhaps we should try to do something about it, provided that it is cheaper to do something about it than to take the consequences of not doing something about it. One has to ask two questions here. One, is it going to warm at anything like the predicted rate? That is the only scientific question that really needs to be answered. And I have studied and indeed lectured at faculty level in the determination of climate sensitivity. I have written papers in the reviewed literature on the subject. So I do have some knowledge of it as a reasonably competent mathematician who has profited enormously by the use of mathematics over the years. The Eternity Puzzle that I launched here in Australia 12 years ago became Puzzle of the Year in Australia. I'm glad you all enjoyed it so much. But the central point here is that that's the first question. How much warming are we going to get? It is now blindingly obvious, if you look at the data and the evidence, that the rate of warming simply isn't enough to be sufficient. And even if it were enough to be sufficient, it is blindingly obvious that it is far, far cheaper, and this is the important point, far cheaper, in fact something like 30 or 40 times cheaper, to do nothing about it now than to try to forestall it by the vastly expensive methods that your government currently proposes. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Look, it's a good question because, yeah, one of the strange things that Bob Brown, Natasha Stott-Despoja and Margaret Thatcher have in common is, of course, that they all accept climate change. And it's an even better question because in Australia we have this sort of, well, historically unique situation where we have the Greens and the Labor Party pushing a market-based mechanism to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Again, one that the economists who may or may not be in on the conspiracy all agree is by far the cheapest way to address this problem, while we have the Conservative Party in Australia proposing the direct action scheme, which we've estimated in order to achieve the 700 million tonnes of abatement that the Liberal Party have said is their goal, which is, of course, the same goal as the Gillard government. It's just how we're going to get there. We estimate there would be 150,000 grant applications required to achieve that 700 million tonnes of abatement. That is, under the direct action scheme, companies will fill out a form, say, here's how I'd like to reduce emissions, send it to Canberra, and a bureaucrat will read it and give it a score out of 10, and we'll come up with our favourite ones. We're going to literally require an army of bureaucrats to implement the direct action scheme. So in terms of political, I think climate change doesn't fit in the old left-right of politics. That's why that old lefty Arnold Schwarzenegger was so keen on it. It doesn't fit in the politics. With the economics and the science, both suggest that we should act and that the best way to act is through a carbon price. But again, I just don't understand why the sceptics who say they're worried about the cost of action are so unconcerned about the very high cost of the Abbott proposal of direct action. Again, they both want the same target. They're both proposing 5%. It's just how do we get there?
Thanks. Next question is from Simon Gross.
Simon Gross from Science Media. Last week in the north of this town we had an attack by some Greenpeace activists on a GM, an experimental plot of GM wheat. It reminded me of the symmetry between the public attitudes and acceptance or lack of when it comes to climate science and when it comes to GM plant science. In both cases we have very strong scientific consensus. And in both cases we have a small minority of people who are seen to be sceptics, deniers, ratbags, iconoclasts. So I just want to ask both of you, why is it uncool to be a climate science denier, but it's cool to be a GM science denier?
Richard?
Oh, look, very good question. Why isn't it cool to deny that that the sun causes skin cancer? Why isn't it cool to deny that immunisation protects our children from whooping cough? Why isn't it cool for any number of the conspiracies that you can find on the websites that suggest that all the science is wrong and some herbal remedy is right, why don't we give that 50% of the editorial space in newspapers? Why don't we go and find the people that think that immunisation is causing disease, not protecting children, and give them 50% of the space on opinion pages? I mean, it's a fascinating question. Why have we taken scepticism about climate science and said that, sure, it might be a minority opinion, sure, the overwhelming majority of scientists might have reached settled conclusions based on data? We're talking about data that needs to be rejected here, not just models. Why is it that as a society we've placed climate scepticism on a pedestal, yet common sense tells us that yes, we understand why people might be concerned about GM crops, but we dismiss them as quirky. Yes, we understand why people might be concerned with immunisation, but without a strong scientific basis, as opposed to a really strongly held opinion, we just don't put them up on a press club address. You know, I've never seen the immunisation sceptics here at the press club.
Well, hey, baby, I think that climate science scepticism is cool. And I think we ought to just mention a little bit about the history of Greenpeace, because it was founded, among others, by a friend of mine, the late Eric Ellington, who sadly died earlier this year. Now, Eric was a lovely man. He was totally non-political. He, like Patrick Moore and the other founders of Greenpeace, were true carers for the environment. They loved nature. They didn't want us to despoil it. They wanted to raise our consciousness of it. And they established Greenpeace to do just that. And with great sadness, this entirely non-political person said to me one day that he and many of his fellow founders of Greenpeace had had to leave the organisation after a few years because, and this is how he put it, it had been taken over by Marxists who had not the slightest interest in the environment but were willing to use it as a pretext for continuing the battle to bring down the West. So there is, and this was one of the founders of Greenpeace, this is what he said. He's not the only one. Patrick Moore has publicly said what Eric has said to me privately. There is a feeling that these environmental movements have been captured by political forces who are not necessarily friendly to the West and our way of life. So that's one side of it. But then, as far as GM science is concerned, genetic modification has been practiced for decades in crops and has led, among other things, for instance, to what used to be called miracle rice, when I was a lad learning about this in school. And we were taught to admire this because of the greater yields that the rice could achieve, and therefore the many starving people in Africa would be saved from suffering. So I think that what we've got to get back to is true science, whether it's for GM crops or whether it's the climate. No more of this nonsense about consensus. Back to the equations.
Lord Monckton, if I may ask a follow-on question following that. I heard you this morning on radio, and from my recollection is that you articulated that view about Greenpeace. My recollection is that you also suggested that the Greens, both in Europe and in this country, had been effectively hijacked by Marxists and the like, who had an economic agenda. Is that a view that you hold about the Greens in this country, that they predominantly have an economic agenda, which is to, as I think you put it, to destroy the West?
Let me suggest how you can study this question scientifically. Read the Communist Manifesto. It is available online. Read the manifestos of the European Communist parties in the post-war period. Read the manifesto of your own Green Party, and, sir, go figure.
I'll ask Richard, as a former advisor to Bob Brown, to respond.
Well, I encourage you to do exactly that. I would go to the website and read both. But look, of course, the main point is that this conspiracy runs far deeper than the communist takeover of Greenpeace, because Malcolm Turnbull and John Howard and Marius Kloppers and Ralph Hillman, the head of the Coal Association, are in on it. Okay, we just really need an explanation here of what is it that's driving the head of BHP to accept this, and why is Woodside using climate science to predict how much stronger its gas rigs will need to be to resist the climate change that their gas is going to cause.
Next question, Andrew Tillett.
Andrew Tillett, the West Australian. A question for both of you, just about the tone of the debate about climate change, not the one here, but in the wider community, where it seems to degenerate into a lot of name-calling and mudslinging on both sides. And, I mean, we had, like Lord Monckton's beginning of the trip, you were sort of overshadowed with the comments about Professor Garneau, which you subsequently apologised for, but that prompted someone like Malcolm Turnbull to call you a rather sick vaudeville character. That's
better than he manages.
Are we getting? Is there going to be any hope of getting a more civilised tone to this debate, or has it become too polarised?
I'll ask Richard to respond civilly.
I'll start now. Look. Thanks for the question, and I think it's deeply concerning. I mean, I hope that Lord Monckton is right about climate change. I hope that he is right, but I fear that he's not, and that fear is based on science, and that fear is based on evidence. And I think that as a society, as a democratic society, we have to respect each other's points of view. And I'm deeply concerned that climate scientists in Australia have received death threats. I'm deeply concerned that someone wielded a noose in front of a climate scientist in Melbourne last week. I'm deeply concerned that someone spoke at a rally in Queensland recently and said, do you understand why we feel like taking arms up against this government? Because in a democracy, you should make the case, you should debate the case for why you believe you are right, and you should accept the consequences in a democracy of when others don't agree with you. So I'm terrified that in Australia at the moment we are creating a temperature in which, while ostensibly we're having a debate about climate science, there are people whipping up fundamental problems for our democracy, and that is the respect to agree with other people even when you are in the minority. And if a majority agrees to act in a democracy, we go along with it. We don't brandish nooses at people.
First of all, ladies and gentlemen of the press, I hope that you would regard us as conducting a civilised debate here, and I should certainly like at this point to pay tribute to my opponent in this debate, who has conducted himself in an entirely civilised fashion, and I'm going to try to do the same. So can we give him a round of applause? Now, I am concerned that 3 weeks before I arrived in Australia, one of your journalists said that climate sceptics should be branded with tattoos. I am concerned that 2 weeks before I came to Australia, one of your journalists on a leading national newspaper, in that national newspaper, said that climate sceptics should be gassed. Now, I wonder what kind of a regime it was that used to do that to its opponents. And what I'm particularly concerned about, ladies and gentlemen of the press, is that you have quite rightly called me out for a single, inadvertent, crass remark for which I have completely and abjectly and humbly and unreservedly apologised, and I renew that apology now, and yet you have not asked your own number who have done similar things, in fact worse things, to apologise. And Andrew, you say you work for the West Australian. Was this the paper whose headline a couple of weeks ago was "Ban the Lord," with a large picture of me? Was that a civilised tone? I'm not sure that it was. So let us all agree that in future this debate should be conducted at a more scientific level, It is not enough to wave our arms and say the science is clear when the climate is a chaotic object and therefore the science can never be clear. It's not good enough to say the science is clear because there's a consensus, because consensus is not the way science is done. Science is done by hard work, hard research, checking, checking and checking again. Back to those equations again.
Sam Cobble.
Hi, Sam Carville from Australian Associated Press. Sorry, Lord Monckton, you say that you should reject the consensus, but isn't a scientific consensus a consensus of evidence rather than a consensus of opinion? And you say that you're willing to be convinced. What would it take for you to be convinced that climate change was happening?
Right. First of all, climate change has been happening for the last 4,567 million years since that Tuesday on which the world first formed and the first wisps of the atmosphere. So, of course, I do not deny that climate change is happening, nor do I deny that if we add CO2 to the atmosphere, some warming is likely to result. But as a specialist in the field of the determination of climate sensitivity, and I lecture on this, as I've said, at faculty level, I can assure you that there is no agreement among those scientists who have studied that question on how much warming there is going to be, and I have already adduced evidence from the Royal Society who have said exactly that in terms in their restatement of the science on climate just this year. So science, if you're saying that a scientific consensus is somehow not a consensus of opinion, but a consensus of evidence, you have to say, and you did not say, what evidence you mean. On the evidence that I have seen, let us just take one example of it. If we go back to 1750, how much warming has there been since then? Well, using the Central England temperature record as a proxy for global temperatures, it's not bad for that purpose, it's at the right latitude. We've had 0.9 Celsius of warming in response to an addition of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere by us, which is almost equivalent to a doubling of CO2 concentration. That's going to give you around 1 Celsius of warming per doubling of CO2 concentration. Over the last 60 years, we again see 1 Celsius of warming per century happening. All the evidence points to 1 Celsius of warming for a doubling of CO2 and not the 3.3 predicted by the IPCC as its central estimate on current emissions, or the 5.1 Celsius over the next 90 years predicted by your government. These are exaggerations which are not the consensus in the literature. And you should understand that the literature is much wider and reflects far more scientific opinions than many of you have been willing to allow or discover. Get on with your work.
It's interesting that that sceptics so often take the best case scenario they can find in the science and the worst case scenario they can find in the economics and convince themselves that having chosen two extreme positions, it would be crazy to act. There is a range of evidence, and I'll put all this up on our website for people who are interested, but the Joint Academy's statement, the Bureau of Meteorology, the CSIRO, the National Academy of Sciences have all formed an entirely different view than Lord Monckton. So I just think we have to be very careful about distinguishing consensus and expertise and opinion from the fact that the groups that we trust, hopefully that we trust to advise us on these, have uniformly agreed on the conclusion, even if there is some doubt remaining about the decimal places. So again, choosing the best case science you can find, comparing it to the worst case economics you can find, is a very narrow and dangerous way to run a policy debate.
Next question from Jennifer Bennett.
Hello, Jennifer Bennett from Campus Review. Question for Lord Monckton. You're often critical of climate change scientists because they don't like to go head-to-head with you in a public debate. Australian scientists have told us that a debate forum doesn't allow the time and format necessary for communicating complex information. If you're so certain of the facts, why not debate the scientists on their own terms? Why won't you submit the research you say you've undertaken to a quality peer-reviewed journal to be assessed?
I wonder why it is that Professor Tim Flannery, who knows no more about climate science than I do, is never asked that question. Why Al Gore is never asked that question. Why Professor Stephan is never asked that question. And may I perhaps refer the Honourable Lady to Physics and Society for July 2008, where you will find an article entitled Climate Sensitivity Reconsidered. The author is Christopher Walter Monckton of Brenchley, and the article was indeed reviewed by Professor Alvin Saperstein, the Professor of Physics at Wayne State University, and also the review editor of the journal concerned at the time. The American Physical Society, yes, that's right. Indeed it does. So why don't you check with Professor Saperstein to find out whether he in fact reviewed it? Have you done that? No, I didn't think you had. Once again, please will you do your homework? What I'm saying is, if you take a preconceived position on this question, and therefore you don't check both sides of what you are told, rather than only checking my side because you're on the other side, then you will not get a balanced view on this question. The fact is that I am under no more obligation to publish in the peer-reviewed literature on this than anyone else. I have published in the reviewed literature. They try to say it wasn't peer review now, but they were perfectly happy to say it was peer review at the time. They were lent upon. This happens. You know, we too are sometimes victims of the other side going too far and putting too much pressure on. The two editors of that journal were sacked for publishing that paper. They shouldn't have been. It was a perfectly acceptable paper. There's not a lot wrong with it scientifically. And so read that if you want to see what my opinion is on climate sensitivity. It contains 30 relatively clear equations, each one of which the professor required me to justify in order that they could be included in the paper. It was a very thorough scientific review. Thank you.
Sorry, just to follow up.
Jennifer, I'm going to give Richard Wright a reply. Thank you. You've had your chance. I'm going to give Richard Wright a reply. Thank you very much.
Well, look, I agree with Lord Monckton. I urge you to do your homework. I urge you to, we'll put links up on this to our website tomorrow, but, you know, it doesn't take long on the internet to find comprehensive, systematic and, as you said, timely. It takes a bit of time to work through some of the misnomers in the science. The problem is that it only takes a minute to start a bushfire and can take a week to put one out. You know, that's why the scientists don't like these debates, because asking tricky questions is quicker than answering them. And the point about Tim Flannery and Al Gore, well, of course, neither of them claim to be climate scientists, but what they're doing is they're standing on the shoulders of those thousands of climate scientists who have done the work, who have done the equations, who have collected the data, who have questioned each other and settled on a conclusion. So I urge you to do exactly the homework that Lord Monckton is urging you to do, because these questions have been asked many times. I've heard them asked many times, but the answers don't seem to have any impact on the questioners.
Next question, Jacqueline Maley.
Jacqueline Maley from the Sydney Morning Herald. Lord Monckton, you said that the carbon tax is the wrong solution to a non-problem. I'm just interested in your views on the Coalition's direct action policy. It's also a proposed solution to what you say is a non-problem. Should the Coalition ditch it?
Yes, the Coalition should, in my opinion, ditch it, because there is no need to take any action about carbon dioxide at all. That is why Canada has announced that she is not going to participate in a Kyoto 2. Japan has announced the same. Even America has announced the same. China has announced that if she has a carbon tax at all, it will be at just $1.50 per tonne. Why, therefore, set your own working people at a huge disadvantage by imposing upon them a carbon tax at a rate which is unmatched anywhere else in the world, and which most other countries are no longer going to pursue? It is not good enough merely to recite that there is a consensus of thousands of climate scientists. The number of climate scientists who, by measurement, observation and experiment, and by the application of established theory to the results, have even attempted to determine climate sensitivity, which is how much warming we are going to get, numbers not in the thousands, but in the dozens. And most of those have concluded that the matter is indeed highly uncertain, and some of them, such as Professor Richard Lindzen and his colleague Young-Sang Choi, in a paper published earlier this year, have determined that the amount of outgoing radiation reaching space is far greater than that which would allow high climate sensitivity, and they estimate, once again, that there would be less than 1 Celsius degree of warming for a doubling of CO2 concentration. We might also cite Spencer and Braswell, 2010, who have said similar things, having at last measured the cloud feedback and found it to attenuate global warming by as much as the IPCC had thought it increased it. And I could go on reciting paper after paper after paper done by measurement and observation, which clearly establishes the strong likelihood that climate sensitivity is low. And therefore it is not acceptable to say the science is settled. You must read the literature and read it widely and understand that there is no consensus on this, there can be no consensus on this, and the way things are turning out at the moment, the likelihood of high climate sensitivity of any problem whatsoever with the climate is very small indeed.
Richard. Sorry, Alex. Sorry, Richard. Sorry.
And of course, that the literature that's being referred to there is a trivial percentage of the overwhelming evidence. Again, the Joint Academies, the Bureau of Meteorology, NASA. I just refer you back. If you really believe that NASA can't be trusted, that their data can't be trusted, then perhaps you shouldn't use your GPS, and you might want to ask some hard questions about the moon landing. But again, your actual question was where is the sceptic's concern with direct action? If you are genuinely worried about the cost of tackling climate change, and every economist is of the view, or again, Tony Abbott can't find a single economist to agree with him that his scheme is cheaper. If you believe climate change is bunkum, which I don't think is based on the evidence, but if you believe that, you should be more concerned that we would waste billions more dollars tackling it through an inexpensive scheme. Why are climate sceptics economic sceptics as well?
Thank you. Next question from Alex Hart.
Alex Hart from the 7 Network. Sorry for interrupting there. I'm not sure if it's the right title to use, but my question is to Lord Monckton. I'm asking about a letter that was written to you by David Beamish from the UK Clerk of the Parliament over there, saying that he'd like you to stop claiming that you are a member of the House of Lords. What's your response to this? Will you stop using that title? Why or why not? And does it harm your credibility?
Sir, would you be kind enough to read out the words in this box on the passport page?
The holder is the Right Honourable Christopher Walter Viscount Monckton of Brenchley.
Thank you very much. The House of Lords says I'm not a member of it. My passport says I am. Get used to it. What I will do, therefore, since I had, as a condition of taking part in this debate, insisted that ad hominem questions of that futile and drivelling kind should not be asked, I'm going to take a free kick and I'm going to get back to the climate, which is what we are here to debate, not the way the House of Lords works. The IPCC's estimates of the amount of warming from a doubling of CO2 concentration, 2 to 4.5 Celsius, with a central estimate 3.26 Celsius, suggest a feedback loop gain in the climate system of between 0.42 and 0.74, with a central estimate 0.64. However, that is a near impossibility, physically speaking, because in any object on which feedbacks operate, if the feedback loop gain is greater than somewhere in a range of 0.01 to 0.1, the object becomes terminally unstable, and under conditions which might quite easily occur, the loop gain would reach 1 and the system would blow itself apart. Since this hasn't happened, we have a very good evidence from process engineering in this case that once again the likely rate of warming for a doubling of CO2 is 1 Celsius degree. Thank you.
Richard?
Oh, it's my turn to take a free kick. The Australian government is proposing, and there's bipartisan consensus, that we spend around $50 billion, 50 billion with a B, to buy 12 new submarines to replace the 6 we haven't used yet. And no one is certain who we need them to protect us from. And no one is certain what day we will need them, and no one is certain where we should park them on that day, and no one is certain, if you've followed the Navy, whether we'll have enough crew to staff them. But when it comes to making decisions about national defence, when it comes to making decisions about our health, whenever the consequences are high, whenever the consequences are catastrophic, what sensible people do is take the conservative path. The overwhelming evidence is that we face catastrophic risks from climate change. The overwhelming evidence is from the economists that the costs of tackling this will actually be very small, especially in economies as rich as our own. So we can bet the house that Lord Monckton is right, or we could insure the house in case he's wrong.
And a final question today is from Mark Kenny.
Mark Kenny from The Advertiser. Lord Monckton, I'll take it from your response to Mr Hart's question that you reject that letter from the House of Lords.
I've told them it's impertinent and they should put my reply on their website. They have not so far found the courage to answer.
All right. Look, can I ask you a question which I guess is a first principles question that would have been maybe better asked earlier, but would you like to see companies and individuals put less pollution skyward than is the case now and than will be the case with a growing population, or are you unconcerned about it?
Right. Let us distinguish between pollution, which usually means particulate pollution such as soot, or the emission of carbon dioxide, which on any view is not a pollutant. It is plant and tree food. If we were able to manage a doubling of CO2 concentration this century, which is what I expect to happen regardless of the carbon tax, then what we would find is that at the end of the century, the yield of certain staple crops would rise by up to 40%, and they would be able to survive on less water as well. The greening of the planet in the 30 years since satellites have been watching, as a result of what is known as CO2 fertilisation, is absolutely wonderful. It's actually gone up by 6%. The net primary productivity of plants has risen by 6%. So CO2, if you really are a green and you really want to green the planet, is the way to go.
Richard, a quick response, if I may.
Pollution is a harmful byproduct from a process, and unless we've underestimated the generosity of coal-fired power stations for giving us all this free fertiliser for the last 100 years, carbon dioxide is literally a pollutant. It is an unintended and, in a climate-constrained environment, harmful byproduct. And economists have said for 200 years, when you want to solve a pollution problem, the most efficient way to do it is to introduce a price.
On the eve of the census, John Safran seeks out the Jedis and the vampires among us.
Try to find people who sincerely synchronise spirituality with popular culture.
Artscape, tonight, ABC One.
From BBC Earth, the extraordinary three-part series Mountain Gorilla tells the story of the world's last 700 mountain gorillas. On DVD and Blu-ray from ABC Shop Online, ABC Shop Centres and Retailers.
It's not uncommon in the animal kingdom to have a specialised mouth for feeding. To capture termites, numbats have a long, sticky tongue. And termites have hard, saw-like mandibles,